All right, welcome to our 2 o'clock session. We have Jeff Pritchard speaking on American slavery and Liberty Cap. Jeff is a member of Seattle Coin Club, member of Pacific Coast Numismatic Society, resides in Seattle, Washington. The Liberty Cap obviously is a symbol that goes back to antiquity and appears on coins and medals in a variety of contexts. And Jeff is going to dig into that and give us some more color on the culture surrounding the coins and medals that these objects were created in, and hopefully give us a greater appreciation of the use of this device on coins, paper money, and medals. So with that, Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Okay. And thank you, Len, for the introduction. Gosh, you gave half my presentation. My work's half done. Well, I think everyone's pretty familiar with the Liberty Cap. It's been a symbol on our coinage since the 1790s. It appears, as you can see, on some of our most popularly collected U.S. coins. And even today, it appears on the 1-ounce silver eagle. It appears on a number of commemoratives. And this presentation today, it really grew out of broader research I was doing on the Liberty Cap. And when I was doing that research, several vignettes or small episodes surfaced in which the Liberty Cap on our in the US, kind of overlapped or intersected with slavery in America. And those vignettes were fairly poignant, thought-provoking, and in some cases, just sadly ironic. And so that's what this presentation will deal with today. And what I was going to talk about was the birth of the symbol. How did the Liberty Cap come about as a symbol? What did it represent? And how did that representation, what did that symbolism, how did it change over time? And how did the actual cap itself change over time? And then the vignettes, the first is The Genius of America. And this is actually a painting, but it was influenced by, and it's an influencer of US coinage. The second vignette is the Liberia solution. And this is a case where American slavery actually spawned a new country, and then that country used the Liberty Cap on their coinage for almost 100 years. And finally is the episode I call Numismatic's Greatest Irony. And it really is in this case. This is a involves the Confederacy and slavery in America and the Civil War. But it's a series of disconnects, kind of a cascading series of ironies that would really be laughable if they weren't tied to slavery and the Civil War. So with that, virtually every society throughout time, at one time or another, has had slavery. And our story begins about 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. At around 200 BC, if a Roman slaveholder wanted to willingly free one of their slaves, it required a ceremony called manumission. And this took place at the Temple of Feronia. And at the height of the ceremony, the slave was touched with a rod or a staff called a vindicta. And at this point, the slave was officially free. Now, in recognition of that newfound freedom, the slave's head was shaved, and on their head was placed a small white woolen cap, kind of a hard felt-like material, called a pallias. Those two symbols, the pallias cap, which only free persons could wear, and that staff or rod, the vindicta, became symbols of freedom and liberty. And going forward, when the Liberty goddess was portrayed, she would very often be holding the staff and the Liberty cap. Well, it wasn't long before that symbol was usurped to not only represent freedom from slavery, but also freedom from political tyranny, even freedom from religious oppression. This is a denarius of Caius Cassius in 126 BC. And you can see on the reverse of the coin, the chariot driver holding aloft the staff of manumission with the Peleus, the liberty cap. And in this instance, this was representing freedom from political oppression. Well, certainly the most famous and highly prized numismatic example in which the Peleus liberty cap represented political freedom is on the Brutus denarius. Now, this was commissioned between 42 and 43 BC by Brutus and Cassius, who were the two main instigators in the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And they commissioned this coin either to commemorate or perhaps justify the assassination of Julius Caesar. You can see on the coin's obverse the portrait of Brutus. And on the reverse, you have the two drawn daggers representing the assassination. And underneath, of course, the Ides of March when the assassination took place. And in the center is the Peleus, the liberty cap, which again, in this instance, representing freedom from Caesar's political tyranny. Well, interestingly, the Roman population didn't really agree with the assassination. Caesar had made himself fairly popular, and there were riots after the assassination, and Brutus and Cassius actually had to flee the city for their own personal safety. There's about 80 to 100 of these coins in existence. And again, they are highly prized. One sold earlier this year, and that specimen brought a little over $700,000. So not the kind of thing I have in my personal collection. There's actually a golden version of this coin, the golden Eidmar. And this specific example got a lot of headlines earlier this year. Whereas the silver specimens were created for general circulation, the gold version of this coin was intended as a kind of a specimen piece for high-ranking officials. And there's only 3 known to exist. And this specific example was looted or smuggled out of Greece where it had been held and sold in 2021 for a little over $4 million. Well, subsequently, the Department of Homeland Security discovered it had been smuggled out of Greece under false pretenses, under a fraudulent pedigree. And in March of this year, it was returned. And I believe the British coin dealer who was responsible for this fraud, along with a number of other coins he smuggled out of Greece, is currently enjoying the hospitality of the British penal system. But there's only 3 of these in existence. And again, an example of the liberty cap in ancient coinage. Well, from time to time in the ancient Roman period, Libertas, as she was called, is pictured with the staff of manumission and the liberty cap. This is an Elagabalus denarius from 220 AD. And here's another example, a different coin from approximately 250 AD. Again, Libertas holding the staff and the liberty cap. The last known appearance in Roman coinage of Libertas with the staff and cap was in 275 AD. And then there was nothing. There was actually a 1,200-year gap in all of numismatics from the time the liberty cap appeared on that Roman coinage in 275 AD to where it next appeared anywhere in the globe. And that was on a medal dated 1552, French medal commemorating Henry II's France's victory over Charles V of Germany. And you can see this is very similar to the Brutus denarius we looked at earlier. You've got the 2 upraised swords in this case. And I think we can grant the engraver a little artistic license since there was over 1,000 years since it first appeared. But you can see in the center of the swords the engraver's impression of what the liberty cap, what the Peleus cap looked like. And again, this was commissioned by Henry II to promote himself as a benevolent liberator as a protector of Christianity. Well, we move forward several hundred years to certainly what was a huge influence in our early US coinage. And that, of course, is the Libertas Americana medal, done in 1783, commissioned by Benjamin Franklin, by the French medalist Augustin Dupre. And you can see this, the obverse portrays the flowing hairstyle of Liberty, very innovative for the period. And over Liberty's shoulder is the staff, the Vindicta, and on it is the Liberty cap. Now you notice the cap on this engraving is still that kind of that harder, think of very thick felt style of Liberty cap. And during this period, 1780s and 1790s, the style of the Liberty cap kind of underwent a transition. And this was really brought on, or most notable, during the French Revolution. And during this time period, and this was brought on by the French revolutionaries donning the cap, the Liberty cap sort of transitioned to a more softer style, which is called the Phrygian style Liberty cap. And this cap is softer, and it is typically portrayed tilting forward or tilting over to one side. This picture is from a Roman frieze in about 125 AD. And this really became an international icon once the French Revolution was in full swing, because so many of the revolutionaries donned this cap. It actually was worn 20 years earlier by American revolutionaries. For example, groups like the Sons of Liberty, the group that included the likes of Paul Revere, they wore a Phrygian style Liberty cap. Many of our own revolutionary fighters who didn't have the formal continental uniform also would wear the Phrygian style Liberty cap. But it really didn't become an international icon representing freedom and liberty up until the French Revolution. I guess they had a better public relations firm than we did at the time. But this brings us to our first vignette, in which the Liberty cap really overlaps with slavery in America. And this occurs in 1792 in Virginia, or excuse me, in Philadelphia. The Library Company of Philadelphia, which was formed in 1731 by Benjamin Franklin, in 1790, they moved to a new facility. And a kind of a self-promoting artist by the name of Samuel Jennings. Now, his family was from Philadelphia. He was born in Philadelphia, but he was residing in London. But he heard about the library moving. And he reached out to the library and offered to do a large painting for them that they could have on public display, which would also help promote his own work. Well, after some back and forth, the library agreed to have Jennings do this painting. And the library committee that was working with Jennings, they requested that this large painting for public display have 3 themes. And in order of priority, the first was to promote their lending inventory. The library company was actually a for-profit entity, so they wanted to lend more of their books. The second element was patriotism. This was a new country. Certainly patriotism was a appropriate theme. But lastly, they also wanted to include abolitionism. The library committee was primarily composed of Quakers. In fact, Pennsylvania is really where the abolitionist movement started in the US because of the high concentration of Quakers. And the resulting painting, which I'll show you shortly, is considered the first allegorical anti-slavery painting done by an American artist. And this is the work. The resulting work was 5 feet by 6 feet. It actually painted in 1791, delivered to the library in early 1792. And there's actually 2 titles to the work. The first is Liberty Displaying the Arts and Sciences. And the second title is The Genius of America, Encouraging the Emancipation of the Blacks. Now, this painting had kind of an oversized influence at the time because of where it was based. It was based in the library, which was visited by all the city's intelligentsia, if you will. And you have to remember at this time, Philadelphia between 1790 and 1800 was actually the nation's capital. It was kind of the epicenter of all things America. Additionally, a month after this painting was delivered, you had the passage of the Coinage Act of 1792, which established the first mint in Philadelphia in 1792. So a lot of influence. Well, the committee that was working with the artist wanted him to include some very specific symbols. And one of them, of course, was the goddess Liberty with the liberty, the staff, and the cap. And note here that the cap is now the softer Phrygian style Liberty cap, much more pliable. The committee also wanted Jennings to include pictures of African Americans in a pose of, quote, ease and joy, unquote. And to also have a chains at Liberty's feet, obviously to symbolize the anti-slavery theme. Well, Jennings obviously included these things. We see the portrait of the goddess Liberty, and Jennings was actually criticized for his portrayal of Liberty in this painting. This was actually his seminal work. He was kind of considered a mediocre painter, and he was criticized for painting the goddess Liberty in clothes of the period, as opposed to classical Roman or Greek robes. You can see in the background African Americans dancing or celebrating around a liberty pole. And in the midground over to the right, you have four African Americans paying homage to liberty in what one historian called a period pose of supplication, who were about to be freed or had already been freed. But like any good allegorical painting, Jennings included a lot of hidden symbolism in this work. And this is kind of down at the bottom of the painting, sort of in that clutter of items. I think in today's vernacular, we call these Easter eggs. The first, and this is actually one the committee specifically requested, are the broken chains, which in the artist's own words represented Liberty's an emblem to her aversion to slavery. At the bottom of the picture, there's also some sheet music. And this isn't just random sheet music, it's music to Handel's Come Ever Smiling Liberty from Judas Maccabeus. Judas Maccabeus is a 3-act oratorio. I'm not a music officio, so I had to look this up, but oratorios are musical compositions that typically dealt with very sacred topics, and they combined chorus, solo voices, and orchestra. Another Easter egg that Jennings included towards the bottom of the painting is a bust of a man dressed in sort of Roman attire. And historians believe that this bust represents a gentleman named Henry Thornton. Now, Henry Thornton was an extremely prominent and ardent abolitionist in England. He was a member of Parliament, but his real claim to fame was in 1791, when this painting was being done. He had established the Sierra Leone Company, which was intended, albeit misguided, to provide a safe haven for freed slaves. And we'll get in this whole concept of recolonization later in the second vignette. But and I also mentioned that historians believe this. Jennings, the artist, didn't write a lot of this down as far as some of the symbolism that he had embedded in the picture. And so there is some of this that is a supposition. And finally, probably the most cryptic symbol in the painting is that painting of the globe, because Jennings had painted it to specifically spotlight the Caribbean. And again, it's believed he was doing this to highlight the colony of Saint Domingue, which is now Haiti. Because in 1791, when Jennings was painting this, that's when the slave revolts began in Haiti and continued until 1804. And at that time, both the slave population and Haiti itself won their freedom, their independence. But again, the painting's influence was oversized because of being in the library and where it was based. Well, a couple years later, we see on our own earliest U.S. coinage, both the 1793 half cent and the 1794 through 1796 cent. These are not perfectly to scale. We can see the flowing hair Liberty style obviously influenced or copied from the Libertas Americana medal done 10 years earlier by Dupre. But you can see here the staff, the manumission staff over Liberty's shoulder, and the cap on it now is that softer Phrygian style Liberty cap, which had kind of become the norm now as far as the symbol. And this brings us to our second historical vignette in which the Liberty cap is involved. And this is a situation called the Liberia solution, I refer to it, in which American slavery launched a country. And this episode begins in 1816, when a Presbyterian minister by the name of Robert Finley, along with a number of Virginia slaveholders, formed what was called the American Colonization Society. And the goal of the society, for very different reasons, was to resettle freeborn African Americans or freed slaves back to Africa. And the way they had gone about doing this was the society purchased land in the area of Cape Mesurado. And they christened this land, this area, they called it Liberia, which meant land of freedom. And you can see in the map on the left where Liberia still is today, that tiny spot on the most western shores of Africa. Well, I mentioned that the society's members had very diverse interests. This is the epitome of strange bedfellows. On the one hand, you had slaveholders. Slaveholders wanted freed slaves removed from the country. And they had that incentive because they were scared. They were very worried that the same types of slave revolts that occurred in Haiti in 1791 might begin to spread to the US. There were slave uprisings. There were slave owners who they and their families were killed, but it was somewhat sporadic. Slaveholders were worried about this taking root in the US, and they didn't want freed slaves to incite their enslaved brethren. At the other end of the spectrum of the society, you had Quakers, you had Presbyterian congregations, you had abolitionists who were seriously worried that freed slaves would face discrimination, disenfranchisement, a denial of their civil, religious, or social rights. They really believed this was in the best interest for the freed slaves. Well, as you can imagine, this was controversial right from the start, particularly with freed slaves. America, for so many of them, this had become their home. And many of them who had been here for a while had very distant, remote memories of Africa, and certainly no ties to that very tiny spot of Africa that Liberia was based. But in 1822, the society began recolonizing, resettling slaves who freed slaves, voluntarily opted to go. They were given 6 months of provisions, and they were given small plots of land. But just like in the early settlers to the US, or the early colonists in the US back in the early 1600s, the going was extremely hard. And this was primarily because of diseases. Between 1822 and 1843, about 4,600 freed slaves were resettled in Liberia. But by 1843, only about 1,800 had survived. So less than 50%. Much of that was disease. The other element is that the freed slaves, the African Americans who are now in Liberia, didn't get along with the local tribespeople. There were a lot of bloody clashes. A lot of people were killed in that fashion. Um, One of the ironies, I think, of this episode is that a number of the freed slaves who were now in Liberia had farms and they needed labor. And so a number of them captured local tribespeople and made them slaves, which is kind of sadly ironic in this case. Well, as I mentioned, this concept of recolonization was supported by some of our earliest and most ardent abolitionists. That included the likes of Henry Clay, of John Adams, of Abraham Lincoln, and it included Thomas Jefferson. And you could do a whole webinar on Thomas Jefferson and slavery. I think today we all realize that Jefferson's views on slavery were complicated, were contradictory, were hypocritical, and I'm digressing a bit here, but some of the contradictions that I certainly stood out in my mind is we all know he wrote that all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. In fact, in the first draft of the Declaration, Jefferson specifically included the inhumanity of the slave trade, which at that time was dominated by Great Britain. That was dropped in the first draft, and yet Jefferson himself was a slaveholder. He proposed legislation in 1784 in the Virginia State House that would have eliminated slavery in the state of Virginia by the year 1800. But he never expended any real political capital or made any great effort for passage of that legislation. And several years before his death, Jefferson wrote of the necessity and the righteousness of emancipation. And yet, even on his deathbed, he never freed his own bondsmen. But Jefferson wrote something which is particularly poignant, and that's why I'm digressing so much. In 1781, he wrote what's called the Notes on the State of Virginia. Now, in reality, this was kind of like a professional diary. It was his personal musings on a wide variety of subject matter. One of them was this whole concept of recolonization. And in that publication, it was published in 1785, actually against his wishes. Jefferson was actually concerned that his views on slavery and other issues were too moderate, and it would actually hurt him politically. But in it, he wrote that it would be exceedingly difficult to retain and incorporate the blacks into the state because white prejudice and black memories of past wrongs would lead to disorders. And I highlight those words, those 8 words, because here we are. It's kind of it's a pretty sad commentary. 250 years later, I don't know, 10, 12 generations later, and we still, as a society, struggle to resolve these two, I guess, opposing dynamics. Okay, I digress enough. Back to numismatics. So in 1847, the American Colonization Society, after supporting Liberia financially for 25 years, pulled the plug, essentially. They contacted then Governor Roberts, who incidentally was the first black governor of Liberia, that they could no longer support them and they were on their own. So shortly after that, Roberts declared Liberia an independent republic. And that was on July 26, 1847. And you can see certainly the similarities between the US flag and the Liberia flag. The Liberia needed coinage. And so they contracted with private mint, the Soho Mint of Birmingham, England, to create their first official coinage. And they used this design on most all their coins, despite the denomination. And on the obverse, you can see Liberty wearing the Phrygian style Liberty cap. And the star on it is representative that Liberia was the first independent republic on the entire continent of Africa. They actually used this obverse on their coinage up until the mid 1930s. At that time, they replaced it with more, I guess, sort of African-centric features, also or images, and also people from Liberia's history. They used this design for over 100 years, or almost 100 years. Sorry. On the reverse, you have the palm tree, and this was a very common motif or symbol on coinage throughout all of the Western African area during this period. And far in the horizon there on the open seas, you have a side paddle wheeler under steam. Now, interestingly, in 1865, Liberia created a number of patterns in the possibility of replacing that design we just looked at. And I think this is certainly the most interesting pattern because you can see it's almost a carbon copy of our own seated liberty coinage, which was used in the US at this time. On the reverse, you have the eagle, and on the shield, instead of the stripes on the US coinage, you have that familiar palm tree. And if you look really close, you can see their attempt at putting a side paddle wheeler on that small image. But the obverse, again, here we have our own, similar of our own seated liberty. You've got her holding the staff of manumission. You have the liberty cap atop it. And again, both the star shining above the goddess Liberty and on the Liberty cap, that star representing Liberia being the first independent republic on the entire continent. One of the nice things the engraver did on this pattern was to give Liberty more African-like features, which, considering their history, certainly would have been appropriate and fitting had they actually adopted this design, which they actually didn't. And the timing of this in 1865 with what's going on in the US, I actually don't know if that tied in with proposing this design, but it certainly could have played into it. One of the things you see is a lot of the people in Liberia, once the Emancipation Proclamation was signed and after the Civil War ended, a lot of them wanted to return to the US. Well, this brings us to our third vignette, in which the American Liberty Cap is involved with slavery. And that's what I call numismatics' greatest irony, which it certainly must be. This is involving the Confederacy, Civil War, and it involves a series of disconnects, which truly would be laughable if they weren't directly tied to the tragedy of the Civil War and the atrocities of slavery. Now, to set the table, I'm going to run through a very quick chronology with you. So, December 20th, 1860, South Carolina is the first state to secede from the Union. So, as they say, the game's afoot. January 26, 1861, the Republic of Louisiana, they actually called themselves that for about 6 weeks, seizes the U.S. Mint in New Orleans, all the facilities, and about $900,000 in bullion. 2 weeks later, Louisiana joins the Confederate States of America. And on April 1st, Louisiana officially turns the mint and all the facilities and remaining bullion over to the Confederacy. And then almost a month later to the day, the Secretary of the Treasury of the Confederacy, C.J. Memminger, officially closes the New Orleans Mint, and it remains closed for the duration of the war. Now I'm going to start, and this may surprise a few of you. I'm going to start by talking about a coin I'm purposely excluding from this conversation about irony and the disconnect at this time. And this is the so-called Confederate cent. And I'm excluding it despite the fact this coin has a very colorful, compelling, even a mysterious history to it. Despite the fact that serious collectors will pay over $100,000 to own one of the 16 known specimens of this coin. And despite the fact that on the obverse, you clearly have the Phrygian style liberty cap. In this instance, it's worn by Minerva, the god of war and justice. The reason it's not germane to this actual discussion involving the irony is because there's no actual proof that anyone affiliated with the Confederacy ever commissioned the coin, saw the coin, and certainly never approved the coin. By all accounts, this coin was essentially a fantasy piece done by an opportunistic tokens engraver by the name of Robert Lovett, based in Philadelphia. And he did this in the hopes that would eventually be accepted and approved by the Confederacy to his eventual benefit. He actually used this design, not the lettering, obviously, but the Minerva picture with the Liberty cap, on 3 prior commercial tokens that he had done. And in the September issue of the Numismatist, for those of you who are interested, there's a great story on the Robert Lovett tokens that were tied to a specific hotel that had some history tied to the Civil War. And the other thing is, based on what I'm going to touch upon momentarily, if senior members of the Confederacy had to approve this design, and by that I mean the president of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, this coin would never have seen the light of day. But let's look at the coins that we know were involved with the Confederacy and where this irony really begins. So from January 26th to March 31st of 1861, when the mint was under Louisiana's control, they minted a little over 1.2 million half dollars. And during the month of April, when the Confederacy controlled the mint, they created another 960,000 half dollars. Now, in reality, they were just using, for the most part, the United States half dollar dies that were being used prior to the South seceding from the Union. And this is where the irony really kind of starts. You know, here you have the Confederacy that will soon be fighting, killing, dying in an attempt to preserve slavery. And yet at that very moment, they are frantically creating as many half dollars as possible that picture the goddess Liberty holding the staff of manumission with the Liberty cap, the 2 symbols that celebrate the freeing of slaves. Well, the Confederacy initially wanted to do their own half dollars, have their own coinage. And so in early April of 1861, the Secretary of the Confederate Treasury, C.J. Memminger, called for design proposals. And the design that he selected for the Confederate half dollar again increases the irony, so to speak. The obverse of the design that he selected was the very same U.S. half dollar design with Liberty holding the staff and the Liberty cap. Now, in reality, this was done for practical purposes. All the dies for coins were made in Philadelphia and then shipped to the branch mints, whether that was Dahlonega, whether that was Charlotte, or in this case, whether it was New Orleans. So there was no experienced coin engravers or die sinkers in the South. So using this obverse would have allowed the mint to continue using those U.S. dies that were left over. But it's the reverse where the real irony increases, because this is the half dollar reverse, actually designed by the Confederacy and intended for their use. And you can see the reverse has the shield with 7 stars and 7 stripes. Now, the 7 stars and stripes are intended to represent the 7 states that had seceded from the Union at this time. Eventually, there would be 11. To our left of the shield are cotton blossoms, and to the right are, and I've seen this referred to as wheat, I've seen it referred to as sugar. But above the shield, just as plain as can be, you've got the staff of manumission holding a Liberty cap. Now, 4 of these pattern half dollars were created, and they are highly prized by serious collectors. Meminger received one of these four patterns. He in turn presented or gave it to President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis. Now, we don't know if Meminger was familiar with the underlying symbolism of where these symbols really originated. Meminger himself was a slaveholder. In fact, prior to joining the Confederacy, Meminger had a law practice, and most of his clients were slaveholders, prosecuting runaway slaves and whatnot. But we do know that Jefferson Davis was intimately familiar with this symbolism. And as a result, there's no way he could have been happy about this design. It's often overlooked, but Jefferson Davis, prior to the South seceding from the Union, Jefferson Davis was the United States Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce's administration between 1853 and 1857. Well, in addition to those responsibilities, Davis was tasked with the Capitol extension construction. That included overseeing what would be a 20-foot tall bronze statue that would be placed atop the Capitol dome, entitled Freedom. So in 1854, a sculptor by the name of Thomas Crawford was commissioned to create this statue that would stand atop the Capitol dome. He was also commissioned to create two marble allegorical statues inside the Capitol, one of history and one of justice. They were going to be in a portico above a doorway that Crawford was also designing. Well, Crawford's original design of the Statue of Freedom to be placed atop the dome envisioned Freedom wearing the Phrygian style Liberty cap. Well, when Jefferson Davis saw this, in more current terms, he kind of went ballistic. And there was no way he was going to let this happen. Davis's feedback, which was probably cleaned up as it was transitioned, was relayed by intermediary Montgomery Meigs, who wrote that Davis does not like the Liberty cap introduced into the composition, that American liberty is original and not of the freed slave. So based on this communication, it's pretty clear Jefferson Davis clearly understood what this symbolism represented. And Crawford, because this sculpting commission was based on Jefferson Davis's goodwill, and it was an important commission, he relented to Jefferson Davis's quote request. The Liberty cap that had intended to be atop of Freedom on the Capitol dome was replaced with a war bonnet. And this picture you see is the statue that stands there today atop the Capitol dome. The Liberty cap that was going to be atop of the figure history inside the Capitol was replaced with a laurel wreath. So here you have the very imagery, symbolism that Jefferson Davis was adamant in not having related to the U.S. Capitol when he was the Secretary of War. It's the very same symbolism that appears on that Confederate $50. Well, about a month after General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, Jefferson Davis was finally captured by Union troops. And one of the very few items in his possession when he was captured was that Confederate $50 given to him by Meminger. And this is the actual specimen. There's two of the four specimens are in private hands. Two of them are in a museum or in museums. But Davis's specimen of this $50 was stolen or seized while he was in captivity. And it essentially disappeared for almost 100 years. And then it unexpectedly resurfaced in 1961 at a New York City coin show. The specific coin traded hands in private sales a number of times until 2015, when it was sold in public auction for the tidy sum of $880,000. 2 years later, the Newman specimen, which was a proof 40 versus a 30, sold at public auction in 2017 for 960,000. So again, highly prized specimens. Well, there's a real poignant metaphor to this last episode. During this period of time, all the U.S. silver coinage in the U.S., or predominantly all of it, carried that liberty-seated design. This was sort of our coin of the realm, picturing the goddess Liberty holding that staff of manumission with the liberty cap atop of it. And so at the very time Jefferson Davis is captured, the South is finally defeated, not only does Jefferson Davis carry those two symbols of manumission on the Confederate half dollar, but virtually every U.S. citizen in their purse, in their pocket, is carrying those symbols of manumission. And it's kind of poetic, I guess, a poetic testimony or poetic justice for a nation once and for all ridding itself from the scourge of slavery. On an overarching note, after having viewed all the history and the interactions, I kind of like to think that our continued use of the Liberty Cap on our coinage, be it the 1-ounce silver eagle, be it commemoratives from time to time, really kind of acts as a marker or a reminder, both of how far we've come, but also the work we still have to do in getting closer and closer to achieving our nation's founding ideals. And with that, I will be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. That was really interesting. Any questions? Please type them into the chat. First question, didn't the Liberty Cap appear on some French coins?
Yes, it was. In fact, that's probably where there's real controversy in putting the Liberty Cap onto Liberty herself. That was one of Thomas Jefferson's complaints, because then it would picture theoretically Liberty as being a freed slave. In 1795, and I think maybe earlier than that, the French coinage did have the Liberty Cap, the Phrygian style Liberty Cap, on the goddess Liberty. And that early coinage was actually designed by Augustin Dupre, who also did the Libertas Americana medal.
All right, next question is or a comment. Memminger's placing of the Liberty Cap on the Confederate half might have possibly reference to the South's notion that they were liberated from the tyranny of the North.
No doubt, because that is one of the symbolisms that that was adhered to it. I think my view on the irony is that clearly those symbols originated with slavery. And so during the time in the US, when slavery was so controversial leading up to the Civil War, we were issuing the seated liberty coinage that, again, the origination of those symbols was celebrating the freedom of slaves. So I would agree you could interpret the symbolism differently, but I think the irony still is there.
Next question. The 4 CSA half dollars, where were they struck?
Well, if we're talking about the seated Liberty U.S. coinage, they were struck in New Orleans and Philadelphia. And Len, you probably know better than I where else they might have, what other branches they might have been struck at, but certainly those two.
Yeah, I think it's most likely it was New Orleans because one of those 4 coins ended up in the hands of, I believe, the New Orleans coiner. So
if we're talking about those 4 specimens,
yeah.
Yes, they were struck in New Orleans. The coiner's name is Taylor.
Right.
And in 1879, he came forward. He was worried he'd be tried as a traitor. He came forward, and that a lot of our knowledge about the Confederate half dollars were sourced from communications from Taylor beginning in 1879, and he was the chief coiner.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question. Or comment. Oddly enough, the 1833 Liberia sent by the American Colonization Society did not include the rod and cap.
Well, that was in 1833, before Liberia was an independent country. Liberia's coinage before that did picture a palm tree. It was really unusual symbolism. It was a palm tree with an African leaning against it, looking out to the ocean, which you could draw a lot of conclusions as far as what they were trying to symbolize with that. But it wasn't until 1840s that they'd had kind of their independence that they put the Liberty cap onto their coinage.
All right. Next question. Is there a list of coins that bear the Liberty cap?
Probably. I'm not familiar with it, but if you start with Google, I'm sure you could one together fairly quickly.
Yeah.
I think my assumption would be the difficulty in that might be in the ancient coinage in Rome, because libertas was pictured often without the cap or without the staff. And so if you just Google coinage libertas, you'd get a lot of examples that where the cap wasn't actually part of the portrait.
Yeah, you could certainly create that list for ancient coins. And then, in terms of medieval coins, I don't know if that device is used or not. That's another interesting question. All right. Now, with respect to the painting, Liberty displaying the arts and sciences, that was on display in the reading room at the Library Company in Philadelphia in recent years, and they have recently removed it to another part of the building. I was very upset when I went there to do some research and it wasn't there anymore, but so they've moved it within the building. It's not overlooking the reading room, which was really cool. But anyway, but I thought
I have not been there. Now there is the picture of me at the very end is actually only from about a month ago. Jennings did 2 studies for the painting, which are about a foot by a foot. The Metropolitan Museum in New York and the American wing has one of those studies, which the detail isn't nearly as good, although clearly all the symbolism and most of the things are there, but the detail is obviously you can't have it. There's another study that has a British shield in it because Jennings was going to profit from this by doing reproductions in both Great Britain and the US. And it's in a museum, and I off the top of my head, I can't recall where it is, but I didn't realize that the main picture had now been removed from public view, which is unfortunate.
But it's really interesting, so this painting is conceived in 1791 and produced in 1792. Right at the same time, they're doing designs for the U.S. coinage, and it's got all these same elements. There's a staff, a liberty cap, chains, figure of liberty personified, and it's just right in step with what's going on the 1793 chain cent. So really interesting parallel there.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions? Just type them into the chat.
We've probably put everybody to sleep.
I hope not. I thought it was fascinating. So especially when you have these themes that tie antiquity all the way to the present coinage. I think a lot of times as U.S. collectors, we get just really siloed into what's going on in a particular place in the last 200 years, and there's a much broader story here.
Well, as one of the viewers mentioned, I mean, the Liberty cap appears on a lot of Latin American coinage, even Cuban coinage. And there it, as that listener said, it's clearly representing a breakaway from a monarchy or colonial rule. So it embodies a lot of different symbolisms, if you will, even though it originated with slavery.
All right, a few additional comments, just noting that they learned a lot from the presentation, so I concur with that. All right, any final questions? This is your last chance. All right, if not, we will have video from all the presentations available on the site in 2 or 3 weeks. If you got an email notice for the symposium, you will get a notice when the video is posted. And we have presentations running through Friday and Saturday. So hope to see you at one of those. All right, Jeff, thank you very much.
Thank you, Len, and thank all of you for calling in or viewing in. Thanks very much.
All right, see you later.